We back at chapter 2 of contracts, violable contracts, and void agreements. Voidable contracts and void agreements. 10. What agreements are contracts? Telling you what contracts are. Agreeable contract. What is the agreement? All agreements are contracts if they are made by the free consent of parties competent to contract for a lawful consideration and with a lawful object and are not hereby expressly declared to be void. Nothing herein contained shall affect any law in force in India and not hereby expressly repealed, by which any contract is required to be made in writing or in the presence of witnesses, or any law relating to the regulation of documents. 11. Who are competent to contract? Every person is competent to contract who is of the age of majority according to the law to which he is subject, and who is sound mind and is not disqualified from contracting by any law to which he is subject. 12. What is a sound mind for the purposes of contracting? A person is said to be of sound mind for the purpose of making a contract if at the time when he makes it, he is capable of understanding it and of forming a rational judgment as to its effect upon his interests. A person who is usually of sound mind, but occasionally of sound mind, may make a contract when he is of sound mind. A person who is usually of sound mind, but occasionally of unsound mind, may not make a contract when he is of unsound mind. 13. Consent. Defined. Two or more persons are said to consent when they agree upon the same thing in the same sense. 14. Free consent defined. Consent is said to be free when it is not caused by 1. Coercion, as defined in section 15, or undue influence, as defined in section 16, or fraud, as defined in section 17, or misrepresentation, as defined in section 18, or mistake, subject to the provision of section 20, 21, and 22. Consent is said to be so caused when it would not have been given before the existence of such coercion, undue influence, fraud, misrepresentation, or mistake. 15. Coercion defined. Coercion is the committing or threatening to commit any act forbidden by the Indian Penal Code 45 through 1860, or the unlawful detaining or threatening to detain any property to the prejudice of any person whatever, with the intention of causing any person to enter into an agreement. 16. Undue influence defined. 1. A contract is said to be induced by under influence where the relates subsists between the parties, or such that one of the parties is in a position to dominate the will of the other and uses that position to obtain an unfair advantage over the other. 2. In particular and without prejudice to the generally, of the foregoing principle, a person is deemed to be in a possession of dominant the will of another, in particular and without prejudice to the generally of the foregoing principle, a person is deemed to be in a possession to dominate the will of another, A, where he hold a real and apparent authority over the other, or where he stands in a fiduciary relationship to the other, or B, where he makes a contract with the person whose mental capacity is contemporarily and permanently affected by reason of age, illness, or mental or body distress. 3, where a person who is in a position to dominate the will of another enters into a contract with him, and the transaction appears on the face of it or on the evidence adduced to be unconscionable, the burden of proving that such contract was not induced by undue influence shall be upon the person in a position to dominate the will of the other. Nothing in this subsection shall affect the provisions of Section 111 of the Indian Evidence Act 1872 of 1872. Fraud defined. Fraud means and includes any of the following acts committed by a party to a contract or with his covenants or by his agents with intent to deceive another party thereto his agent or to induce him to enter into the contract. 1. The suggestion as a fact of that which is not true, but one who does not believe it to be true. 2. The active concealment of a fact by one having knowledge or belief of the fact. 3. A promise made without any intention of performing it. 4. Any other act fitted to deceive. 5. Any such act or omission as the law specifically declares to be fraudulent. 18. Misrepresentation defined. Misrepresentation means and includes 1. The positive assertion in a manner not warranted by the information of the person making it of that which is not true, though he believes it to be true. 2. Any breach of duty which, without an intent to deceive, gains an advantage to the person committing it or anyone claiming under him by misleading another to his prejudice or to the prejudice of another one claiming under him. 3. Causing, however innocently, a party to an agreement to make a mistake as to the substance of the thing which is subject to the agreement. 19. Voidability of agreements without free consent. When consent to an agreement is caused by coercion, fraud, or misrepresentation, the agreement is a contract voidable at the option of the party whose consent was so caused. A party to contract whose consent was caused by fraud or misrepresentation may, if he thinks fit, insist that the contract shall be performed and that he shall be put in a position in which he would have been in the representations made had been true. Exception. If such consent was caused by misrepresentation or by silence, fraudulent within the means of Section 17, the contract, nevertheless, is not voidable if the party whose consent was so caused had the means of discovering the truth with ordinary diligence. Explanation of fraud or misrepresentation which did not cause the consent to the contract of the party on whom such fraud was practiced or to whom such misrepresentation was made does not render a contract voidable. 19.8. A power to set aside contract induced by undue influence. When consent to an agreement is caused by undue influence, the agreement is a contract voidable at the option of the party whose consent was so caused. Any such contract may be set aside either absolutely or if the party who was entitled to avoid it has received any benefit thereunder upon such terms and conditions as to the court may seem just. 12. Agreement void, where both parties are under mistake as to matter of fact, explanation, an erroneous option as to the value of the things which forms the subject matter of the agreement is not be deemed a mistake as to a matter of fact. 21. Effect of mistake as to law. A contract is not voidable because it was caused by mistake as to any law in force in India, but mistake as to a law not in force in India has the same effect as the mistake of fact. 22. Contract caused by mistake of one party as to matter of fact. A contract is not voidable merely because it was caused by one of the parties to it being under a mistake as to a matter of fact. 23. What consideration and objects are lawfully and what not? The consideration or object of an agreement is lawful or necessary. It is forbidden by law or of such nature that, if permitted, it would defect the provisions of any law or is fraudulent, involves or implies injury to the person or property of another, or the court regards it as immoral, or imposed to public policy. In each of these cases, the consideration or object of an agreement is said to be unlawful. In each of these cases, the consideration or object of an agreement is said to be unlawful. Every agreement of which the object or consideration is unlawful is void. Pardon me. 24. Agreements void if consideration or objects unlawful in part. If any part of a single consideration for one or more objects, or any part of any one of several consideration of a single object is unlawful, the agreement is void. 25. Agreement without consideration, void unless it is in writing and registered, or is a promise to compensate for something done, or is a promise to pay a debt barred by limitation law. An agreement made without consideration is void unless 1. It is expressed in writing and registered under the law for the time being in force for the registration of documents, and is made on account of natural love and affection because parties standing in a near relationship to each other, or unless 2. It is a promise to compensate wholly or in part a person who has already voluntarily done something for the promisor, or something which the promisor was legally compellable to do, or unless 3. It is a promise made in writing and signed by the person to be charged therewith, or by his agent, generally or especially authorized in that behalf, to pay wholly or in part debt of which the creator may have enforced payment before the law for the limitation of suits. In any of these cases, such an agreement is a contract. Explanation 1. Nothing in this section shall affect the validity as between the donor and the donee of any gift actually made. Explanation 2. An agreement to which the consent of the promisor is freely given is not void merely because the consideration is inadequate, but the inadequacy of the consideration may be taken into account by the court in determining the question whether the consent of the promisor was freely given. 26. Agreement in restraint of marriage, void. Every agreement in restraint of the marriage of every agreement in restraint of the marriage of any person other than a minor is void. 27. Agreement in restraint of trade, void. Every agreement by which anyone is restrained from exercising a lawful profession, trade, or business of any kind is to that extent void. Explanation 1. Saving of agreement not to carry on business of which goodwill is sold. One who sells the goodwill of a business may agree with the buyer to refrain from carrying on a similar business within specified local limits, so long as the buyer or any person deriving title to the goodwill from him carries on a like business therein, provided that such limits appear to the court reasonable, regard being had to the nature of the business. 28. Agreements in restraint of legal proceedings, void. Every agreement by which any party thereto is restricted absolutely from enforcing his rights under or in respect to any contract by the usual legal proceedings in the ordinary tribunals, or which limits the time within which he may thus enforce his rights in a void to the extent. Exception 1. Saving of contract to refer to arbitration dispute that may rise. This section shall not render illegal contract. by which two or more persons agree that any dispute which may arise between them in respect of any subject or class of subject shall be referred to arbitration, and that only the amount awarded in such arbitration shall be recoverable in respect of the dispute so referred. Exception 2. Saving of contract to refer questions that have already arisen, nor shall this section render illegal any contract in writing by which two or more persons agree to refer to arbitration any question between them which has already arisen, or affect any provision of any law in force for the time being as to reference to arbitration related judgment. Here's the case, cannot say it, but 29, agreement void for uncertainty. Agreements, the meaning of which is not certain or capable of being made certain, or void. 30, agreement by way of wager, void. Agreement by way of wager or void. No suit shall be brought for recovering anything alleged to be won on any voyage, wager, my bad, on any wager. I'm gonna read that one all over. My mind's so tired, y'all. Agreements by way of wager or void, and no suit shall be brought for recovering anything alleged to be won on any wager, or entrusted to any person to abide the result of any game or other uncertain event on which wager is made, except in favor of certain prizes for horse racing. This section shall not be deemed to render unlawful a subscription or contribution or agreement to subscribe or contribute made or entered into for or toward any plate, prize of sum of money of the value or amount of 500 rupees or upwards, to be rewarded to the winner or winners of any horse race. And whenever they say rupees and stuff, that's like dollars here or whatever. Section 29, I redact that. Section 294A of the Indian Penal Code not affected. Nothing in this section shall be deemed to legalize any transaction connected with horse racing to which the provisions of Section 294A of the Indian Penal Code 45 of 1860 apply. We'll come back. We're going to get to Chapter 3 of contingent contracts.